thumbs up. You can see my screen. We still seeing my screen. Beautiful. All right. Okay. So tonight, what we're going to focus on is Exodus through Deuteronomy. Right. So if we remember Genesis, if you guys were with me last week, Genesis, if we kind of boiled it down, Genesis it really becomes how do I say this? Genesis is the relationship of God to individuals, right? It starts out and we have the story of Adam and Eve and gone through, and then we get to the patriarch. The patriarch is Abraham, father, excuse me, Father Abraham, right? Father Abraham, you have Abraham has Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, Jacob is also known as Israel. And so the end of Genesis ends with the death of Jacob, or again, Israel is his name, and actually the death of Joseph. So we're going to pick up in Exodus then and talking about the progression of God and what we're going to see as we learn to better understand the Old Testament. We begin to see a plot twist, a plot change, right? So Genesis actually ends with the death of Joseph, not just the death of Jacob. Jacob dies. There's a confrontation between the brothers, and Joseph saying, "Hey, don't hold this against us." And Joseph says, "I'm not going to go do that." Excuse me. And then Joseph ends up dying, and his last words are, "Hey, when you leave Egypt," as he's talking to his brothers or the rest of the family that's there, "when you leave Egypt, take me with you, take my bones with you. Don't bury me. Don't leave me in Egypt." So Joseph knew, and we got to believe that God had told him that eventually the family of Israel would leave. So Exodus begins. That's the end of Genesis. Exodus begins, the book of Exodus actually begins with a retelling of who was there when Israel died. So again, Jacob, the man Jacob. And so when we talk about Jacob, we're talking about Israel. Israel was a man. Originally, his name was Jacob. All right. So it's a retelling, and it explains to us there's 70 members. Some of your Bibles may say 75. And so there's 70 or 75 individuals in the family of Israel. It's kind of like Frank's family. If you've ever sat down and talked with Frank, he's got a lot of kids, grandkids, great grandkids, great grandkids, right? And so Israel was the same thing. Jacob, or Israel, had 70 members of his family that had come to Egypt and had settled in Egypt, and that's the beginning of the Exodus story. Okay, so hopefully you're following along with me, right? Because this is important. What happens next is a big piece, because Exodus is the beginning of a new nation, right? Everything that follows from Exodus all the way through now is about a nation and no longer an individual. Okay, so you have a change in Genesis. You've got Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob, who's renamed Israel, right? And that ends there. And then the story of Exodus picks up, and all of a sudden they're no longer a family, but now they're a nation. Okay, does everybody follow that? Because as we begin to see the Exodus story and go through the remainder of the Old Testament, what we're going to see is now God's dealing with a nation and no longer just a people. Okay, so when we begin to read the Genesis stories, we're reading these narrative stories about his relationship with individuals. But now what we're beginning to see in the book of Exodus is God changing his relationship from just an individual relationship to one of a nation. the fulfillment of the Abraham covenant, which was you're going to be a father of many nations. This is, we're seeing that for happen within the book of Exodus itself. So Exodus, actually the Hebrew word for Exodus, or let me say the Hebrew word that they would name this book, you and I, we actually use a Greek term, it's actually Exodus, right? Is Shemot, which actually means the names, okay? Which was the original name of the book of Exodus. And what's interesting when you study the Hebrew side of the Old Testament, well, what we call the Old Testament, or they call the Tanakh, what you find is the name of the book is based on the first letter, or I'm sorry, the first word of the book itself. Okay, so in this in this book, in the book of Exodus, or let's talk about Genesis. Genesis is in the beginning is the first words, right? In the beginning. Well, Genesis means beginning or origin. Okay, so hopefully that kind of makes sense. So if we open up and we read the first part of Exodus, Exodus chapter 1, we're going to read, these are the names. Okay, and so hence the names is the actual name of the book. Now that might not mean much to you, but hold on to that for a second, because what we end up seeing with the book of Exodus is that we focus on our main section. We focus, most of us know, if we know anything about the book of Exodus, what we know is we know the Exodus story. We know them leaving Egypt and exiting Egypt. But the book of Exodus is much, much more than just an Exodus story, right? That's a great Greek way to put it. And so that's where we got our English idea of the book of Exodus, right? But the main story is not actually the Exodus from Egypt. And we miss that because we're kind of duped into believing that Exodus, the book of Exodus, is all about how they leave Egypt. And the truth is, the main story is really about this verse. And it says, and he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Right? So when we think about the book of Exodus, what the book of Exodus is relating to us is the story of God relating to now a nation. Okay. So when we look at Exodus, in fact, you can kind of see Exodus through Leviticus here, that chapters 1 through 15 deal with the oppression of Pharaoh, the killing of babies, the Moses being put into a basket, right? Going to the desert, getting married, the burning bush, going back to Egypt, the 10 plagues of Egypt, and them leaving. That all happens within the first 15 chapters. Chapters 16 and 19 walk through the travel to the mountain of God. So if you remember the call of Moses to Pharaoh is, let my people go that they may worship God. And that was the call, that they would worship God. And so the plan, the original plan, was for them to go worship God, go sacrifice to God. Pharaoh would not allow that to happen. And so now the plan was that they would, being a new nation, would go out and leave. And so when they exit Egypt and they cross the Red Sea, what we see for the next several chapters is just their journey to the mountain of God, their journey to go meet God, because that's the ultimate goal of his people. Come meet with me. And there's stuff in there, and we just don't have time to talk about how they refuted God, that they didn't want to be with him. They told Moses, no, you go. We don't want to go. But then chapters 20 through Leviticus 27, right? So a lot of stuff covers the laws. And the best way to describe this is with America. Now, when the first settlers started coming over, they came over, they journeyed over, and it wasn't until a larger people group came together and they recognized that they needed something to govern them, and they no longer wanted to be governed by the British, right? And so they created their own nation. We created the United States of America, right? Let's say it that way. And so when they did that, what they do? They drafted a constitution, wrote the Declaration of Independence. They created laws that would regulate this new nation. So what we find from chapters 20 through Leviticus, so Exodus 20 through Leviticus 27, are the rules, the regulations, and statutes for a brand new nation.
Okay, so this ain't we going out first.
Does that make sense so far? Are you guys kind of following me? Because we've got to understand that this storyline, that so much is taken up by the laws, because they were a new nation and they needed to learn how to act as a new nation. Not a nation like Pharaoh's or Egypt that they'd seen before, and not like a family like they had been before. They were now a nation, but they were God's nation. And God had rules and regulations and ways to worship and things to do. And so we can kind of look at these laws and get confused, feel like they're muddled, and wonder, what does all this mean? Well, can I just say it would be the same thing today if you grab the Constitution of the United States and begin to read it word for word. You would just get confused. Read all the amendments, all the stuff that's put through there, right? We need all those to be ruled correctly and to be governed and to ensure that our nation works correctly. And so the same thing is happening in the book of Exodus and into Leviticus, with God retelling or not retelling, but setting up for them. This is how you will function from now on as a people group. So any questions? Because I kind of bypass a lot of the great stories of Exodus, because the concept here is that you and I get to understand the role of Exodus in the Bible itself. So when we look at the book of Exodus, then what we need to understand is again, it's not just about this concept of, oh, they got out of Egypt. Again, it's about the overarching God saying that you are now my people. The names matter because you're going to learn who I am, and you're going to learn how to function as my children, as my nation. No longer just a people group, no longer just a family, but you're my nation. Because then we flip into Leviticus, Vakrai, which is he called. Okay. And Leviticus, if we know anything, so Leviticus, Levi, the tribe of Levi. So Levi was one of the sons of Israel, one of the sons of Jacob. The tribe of Levi is the priestly tribe. Okay. So when we talk about Levi, and you'll see Aaron is what they call a Levite. Moses was a Levite, and then the line of priest follows the Levitical line, or the line of Levi. And remember, we talked about that last week, that your tribe mattered, because that put you kind of where you were and how you were going to move forward. So he called. If we look at the first part of Leviticus chapter 1, this is the Lord called Moses. So the he called is the Lord called. So the Lord called Moses and to the tent of meeting, and he begins to talk to them. And the book of Leviticus, from chapter 1 through chapter 27, as we've already kind of talked about, their laws and regulations, but it's about the practice of holiness. How are we to be holy? How are we to be different than the other nations? How are we to be different than the nation of Egypt? And how are we to be different than the nations that we're going to confront as we move on? Because the mountain of God that they were at, it was not their final destination. They understood that there were going to be people groups, Canaanites, Hivites, Jebusites, right, Amorites, right, all these different ites that they were going to have to that they were going to interact with. And so with each and every one of those, they had to recognize, well, how are we going to be holy? And so for 27 chapters, we find the level of holiness that's set up for them as a new nation, to say, these are the things that you must do. So the majority of the book of Leviticus, although there's stories, there are some narratives in there, the majority of the book of Leviticus is all about the holiness standards for the people. This is your nation. This is how you're going to act, because I am your God. I pulled you out of Egypt, and I'm bringing you to a promised land. Okay, so from the Exodus story, from the leaving Egypt to through Leviticus, is not a very long time. We're talking about a year or two time frame that all this happens, right? And the reason I say that is because then comes along Numbers. Numbers is Pomodoro, which is the again the Hebrew word for it, the Hebrew way they would have talked about it, and it just means in the wilderness, because that's where Numbers started. Now, if we do the same thing as we did with the Exodus, most people think, well, Exodus story is all about the Exodus. No, it's not. It's a great story, great narrative, but the story itself is about how God is interacting with the people, how he's creating a new nation, right? Leviticus is the standard or the principle of holiness. How do we be holy? Numbers, although it starts out with a census, it's not just about the numbers. It's about their journey. It's about the 38 years of them in the wilderness. So where Leviticus is such a short time frame, right? Numbers is 38 years. And what we see in the beginning of Numbers is the first couple years, and then there's quite a few years, and then the last 37, 38 years before they get ready to actually enter into the promised land, have another transformation that happens. So if you were to read and you wanted to understand the narrative story, you would actually bypass Leviticus, right? Because what you would do is you would begin to read Genesis, and then Exodus comes along. You begin to read the narrative story of Exodus, right? And there's a section there that you could actually bypass at the end of Exodus because it's all law, and then you would pick the story back up in Numbers, right? So it's like Leviticus is very, very important from a Levitical principle of holiness, but from a narration to understand the journey of the people, it's actually kind of a blip in the story. It's almost like a commercial break, if you want to put it that way, a 27 chapter commercial break. And then that way, when you pick up in Numbers, what a lot of people do, and this is, I'm trying to help people as you read, we get confused and we get bogged down in Leviticus and wonder, how does this relate? It's all law, right? There's very, very little narrative story in there, and there's not much time. But so from Exodus to Numbers is the way that you would read it in a narrative form, right? So that would help you as you're trying to understand the story of, they went from here to here to here, and this happened and that happened. In the book of Numbers, we find a lot of stories about, again, because it's a 38-year time frame, but we find a lot of stories of people saying, why did you bring us out of Egypt to die? You know, we got the water stories, we got the food that's provided, all these things that are happening is such a big portion. So all of Numbers, when we think of Numbers, what we need to get out of our head is, oh, it's just about the census. There's a census at the beginning, there's a census at the end. They count, right? So we know the numbers, but the whole of the book of Numbers is the narrative story of while they're in the desert, getting ready to go into the promised land, or really getting ready for the book of Deuteronomy, which is the death of Moses. So any questions so far? Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers.
You're doing a good job explaining. It's hard to understand in the first place, so you're actually doing a really nice job.
Okay, good. I hope people are getting this, because I know I'm kind of flying through it, but it's helpful, because what we'll end up seeing as we read these stories. That's my goal, is to get you to the point where you can read and understand the stories.
Yes.
That you have a different mindset of reading, because when you understand why it's written the way it is, or the focus of the book, or the focus of the chapters, it'll help you. Because the book of Deuteronomy, Davarim, which means words. Okay.
Yes.
In the beginning of Deuteronomy, Moses actually says, if I can go to it.
It's really neat.
These are the words of Moses. That's the beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 1. Mm-hmm. So the purpose of Deuteronomy is the final words of Moses.
Wow.
Right? So from Exodus through the end of Deuteronomy, we have again, God bringing a nation together, but bringing a nation together through the man, the prophet Moses. And so here we have in Deuteronomy chapter 1, we have Moses saying, okay, guys, for the next 34 chapters, roughly, I am going to tell you my last words, you know. And if you've heard me before, I talk about the last words of anybody are always the most important. Well, Moses had a lot of them. And so in the book of Deuteronomy, what we find as the final words of Moses is a retelling of a lot of the commands of God, a lot of the rules and regulations. There's stories in there. There's some narratives, but Moses is saying, okay, y'all, remember Leviticus, remember going to the mountain. So if we can kind of picture, like if I could draw, I would love to draw for you right now and help you see. So they leave Egypt and they're on this journey. They get to the Red Sea, and there's that battle at the Red Sea. It's not really a battle. God wins the battle. But they cross the Red Sea. The Egyptians try to. They can't do it. They get to the other side. They set up the stones of remembrance, which, you know, we talked about last year, right, in June. Set up the stones of remembrance. Moses has a song. Miriam has a song. They sing. They're all happy. Life is great. The next day, they realize they don't have water. They complain, blah, 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 right? And they journey to the mountain of God. They get to the mountain of God, and there's God. And he's saying, okay, now consecrate you guys. And what that means, it means clean yourself up, wash your clothes, you know, make sure you don't do anything that would make you unclean, right? Because you're going to meet with me. And so God tells the whole nation. He looks at Frank and Rachel and Angie and Dorothy and Clarita and Pastor Jen and whoever else is on, right? And he says, okay, you all are going to come up to the mountain, right? And then all of a sudden you guys call me up and say, hey, Pastor, no. Why don't you go up instead? That's what ends up happening. God says, I want everybody. And they all say, no, Moses, you go do it yourself. So Moses spends the time, he gets the 10 Commandments. You know, Charlton Heston shows up, right? Breaks the 10 Commandment things, you know, and they go through. So that's Exodus, right? And Leviticus, because that's when he goes down Moses goes back down and the people says, okay, here's everything God told me. This is what he told me about how we should live, about the different feasts and different celebrations we have, about keeping the Sabbath holy. This is what he told me about the tabernacle. And remember, every piece, if you guys were with me in the tabernacle series, God told Abraham or Moses every single piece that he was going to make. And so that's the book of Leviticus. As Moses is retelling the children of Israel, or telling them, not retelling, but telling them what God told him, because that's what they wanted originally. They wanted Moses to go up the mountain, meet with God, come back and tell him everything. That's what Moses is doing at the end of Exodus and all of Leviticus, saying, this is everything God told me. This is everything that God showed me, right? Then the book of Numbers shows up, and they break camp, and they start leaving the mountain of God and heading towards the promised land. Okay, so if we think of Numbers becomes this journey into the wilderness to get to where they're supposed to go, but they get sideways on God, and they can complain about God, complain about Moses, complain about Aaron, start doing stuff. And finally, God, after several times, has enough and says, okay, everybody that saw the miracles in Egypt, y'all don't get to go to the promised land. You're going to die. And so for the next 38 years, you're going to march around the desert. You're going to march around the wilderness. That's the book of Numbers. They end with the book of Numbers, right? And the time frame has ended. And Moses recognizes everybody but him, Joshua, Caleb, have died, right? All these individuals that were not going to be allowed, right? The book of has the spies, right? Leviticus has the spies that go in, right? So that's where Numbers is, right? Or I'm sorry, Numbers is where the spies are, right? And so at the end of Numbers, then, right, Moses recognizes, okay, it's time for the people to go into the promised land. And it's time for me to die. Because Moses knows, God had already told him that he also was not going to be able to go into the promised land. So he recognizes, I'm going to die. And so he begins to retell them everything he told them when he got off the mountain back in the book of Exodus. Any questions on that?
No, it's clear.
Okay. So when we open the book of Deuteronomy up, what you'll see is, if you read Deuteronomy, you've read Leviticus. If you read Deuteronomy, you've read a lot of the last part of Exodus as well. Because again, you've got the retelling of the Ten Commandments. You've got the retelling of the Sabbath. You've got the retelling of all these laws and the things that God had told them before, because he wanted to remind them. Because he wanted to remind them of this one thing, and that is monotheism. So what is monotheism? Monotheism is there is one God. All right. Why that is important is because every other nation that they've ever either interacted with or will interact with were polytheistic, right? Meaning many, poly meaning many gods, right? And so Moses is relating to them and reminding them there is but one God. Remember what happened in Exodus. Remember the story of the burning bush. Remember what happened in Egypt. Remember the journey through the Red Sea. Remember being at the mountain. All that happened because of one God, monotheism, right? Hold on to that concept of one God. From here on out, you must, and this is what Moses is trying to relate to them, remember there is one God and he has one standard. There, and it's so important because of what they were going to deal with. And can I tell you, in our world today, this is the problem we have, that we have many gods. Now, we don't sacrifice like everyone else. We don't bow down or worship them. But what I mean by this is that we've been perverted by the cultures around us, and the purity of what Christianity was supposed to be has been perverted. There's no other way to put it. People are following different doctrines. They're following different ways, but there has only been one God, and there will only be one God, right? And that's what Moses was trying to tell him. He's like, oh, stay true. Remember, this is dying words. He's like, stay true to the fact that one God, Yahweh, Jehovah, he's the one that pulled you out of Egypt. He's the one that helped you cross the Red Sea. He's the one that provided manna and quail and water and defeated all these people that you've already met. He's the one that's going to help you in the promised land. He's one God. And I'm so emphatic by this because we need to understand this Exodus through Deuteronomy story is all about this one God relating to a one nation and saying, you are my people and I have a standard for you. And if you just follow the standard, if you just do what I've asked you to do, everything is going to be awesome. It's like Adam and Eve all over again, right? I mean, think about it. That's what he told Adam and Eve. If you just do what I've asked you to do, don't eat from this tree, everything else is open, fair game, go for it. Life's going to be awesome for you. And then decide not to. And he's telling them one more time. Now it's not just two people. He's saying it to a nation. I think 600,000 men over the age of 20. I think in the beginning of Numbers, right? It's a lot of people. That's just men, 600,000 men. And he's telling this whole nation, if you just follow what I've told you, and we told you 40 years ago, we're retelling you today. It hasn't changed. It's the same stuff. The 10 Commandments are still the same. I haven't added to them. I haven't taken away from them. It's just the same thing over and over again. If you just follow it. And Moses ends up saying near the end, I know that you guys aren't going to. And he says, so when you don't, just understand a curse is coming. When you don't, life is gonna be bad for you. But he's still, as someone dying and someone who loves the people so much, he's still just emphatic saying, if you just remember one God, if you remember there's one God, everything's going to go well for you. Near the end of Dueteronomy, and I love this, it says, this day the Lord your God commands you to do these statutes and rules. This is Moses talking, and he's retold all of Israel. He's retold them the laws, the rules that they must follow, the things that they must do. And he says, you shall therefore be careful to do them with all your heart and with all your soul. Verse 17, you have declared today that the Lord is your God and that you will walk in his ways and keep his statutes and his commandments and his rules and will obey his voice. Understand, in the book of Exodus, they had said, we're going to do everything God said. And
Pastor
then in the
James?
book of Deuteronomy, when he retells the story, they again say, yes, we will do everything. So Moses tells them, you've declared it. You said it. It came out of your mouth. I didn't put it in your mouth. You agreed to all this stuff. He says that, and in verse 18, and the Lord has declared today that you are a people for his treasured possession. The story of Exodus through Deuteronomy is wrapped up in that one little verse, verse 18. And the Lord has declared today that you are a people for his treasured possession. And as he has promised you, and that you are to keep all his commandments. He's saying to them, this story, the reason that you were pulled out of Egypt, the reason that you even got to Egypt with Israel, with Jacob originally as a people, and are now leaving and left Egypt as a nation, was so God could have you as his own personal, his precious, his treasured possession. That excites me to think about, that God weaves so much into this just to get him to this point, always calling him. And Moses saying, Exodus through Deuteronomy, understand, children. If you just understand one thing, this God, this one God, loves you so much. He's done everything in his power to bring you to this part because you're his treasured possession. He loves you. He's infatuated with you. He wants to spend time with you. You just have to keep his commandments. That's all you have to do. He's told you exactly what you have to do. There's no guessing in this. You know, if you got a boil on your hand or you've got a rash on your hand, God tells you what you got to do. If you've got mold in your house, God tells you what you got to do. Do you guys realize that? I mean, in the book of Leviticus and again in Deuteronomy, it goes through, you know, what happens if your clothes get a spot on it that might mean mildew. This is how you're going to take care of it. God was very, very specific with them. Didn't leave anything up for imagination. Right? He's like, this is all you have to do. How awesome is that? Verse 19. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little excited. I'll calm down.
No, you're okay.
And then that he will set you in praise and in fame and in honor high above all nations that he has made, and that you shall be a people holy to the Lord as he promised. Think about that. Think about what he said. He says,
Amen.
you are going to be a greater nation than any other nation that God has made. Recognize that God has made every nation, but for whatever reason, God chose you as a treasured possession. And for whatever reason, he's going to set you up higher because you are a holy people. The book of Leviticus. These are your standards for holiness. You are set apart. That idea of holy, set apart, not like any other nation, to the Lord your God, as he promised. Not as I. And Moses is very, very specific here to let them know it's not about me, guys. It's about God. It's about that one God that I'm telling you about, that's pulled you out. And that one God is going to be the one God with you. And if you talk to a Jewish person right now, and if we could sit them down here and ask them to tell us about the book of Dueteronomy, what they would tell us is, this is how we know there is one God, the book of Dueteronomy, right? That's important to understand, that their whole concept of who God is in the book of Dueteronomy, right? Based off of that. And so when we travel from Exodus all the way through Deuteronomy, what do we see? Well, you see in the book of Exodus, what you see in the book of Exodus, you see, I am your God. Right? What do we know of the story of the bush and Moses? Moses says, well, who do I tell them? What's your name, God? And what does God say?
I am.
I am. He says, I am. That is my
Gold
name.
star.
You're going to know me. I am that I am. That's who you're. Right. One God. And so in the book of Exodus, the word, instead of saying Exodus, let's talk about like a Hebrew person, we'd say the name, right? The names. Well, who's the name? The name of God. They know, they begin to understand and recognize God, Yahweh. I am. He is the one. And he says, I am your God. That's man, talk about powerful. They begin to have an identity of that they have a God. It's not Osiris or Horus or any of these gods that the Egyptians celebrate and worship, right? There is one God, I am. One God. And he says, not only am I, am I your God, but you are now my people. You're my nation, right? And this is how we're going to have a relationship together. That's Exodus through Deuteronomy. We read it in so many. We'll talk about kind of how boring Exodus through Deuteronomy is, and or at least how boring Exodus gets after the story of the crossing of the Red Sea. But what we see there is anything but boring. What we see there is God saying, this is how we're going to have be in relationship, because I am your God, one God. You are my treasured possession, and we're going to be together. And this is how we're going to function together, because I am a holy God, and you must be holy to relate to me. You must be holy to be in relationship with me. You must be set apart from every other nation, anybody else that you run into. You must not be like Egypt, and you must not be like the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, anyone else that you're gonna run into. You are a holy nation created by me for my plans, for my purpose. So when we think of that concept, guys, we begin to understand that the story of Exodus and through Deuteronomy, Leviticus, which again is boring. A lot of it is very boring if you're reading it from a narrative standpoint, looking for a story, because it's just going to tell you a lot of laws, a lot of regulations. But if we begin to read the narrative, we begin to put it together and understand the functionality of what is happening, what we end up seeing is a story where God is pouring his love out like you can never imagine upon a brand new nation. This was a people group that didn't have government. They had nothing. They didn't have welfare system. They had absolutely nothing. And it came out of Egypt, and God said, you don't need anything but me. I am your one God. And we're going to have a relationship together. You're going to be my people. You're going to be a holy nation. And I'm going to be your God. I'm going to be your government. I'm going to be your leader. And as we move on through, we're going to see next week, we're going to talk about Joshua and begin to get into the promised land piece. What we're going to begin to see is that pulling away from this nation that they're only, all that God ever wanted them to do was be in a relationship with them. But what we're going to see is a nation that begins to pull away, even in the midst of getting into the promised land. So I burned through that material very, very quickly. So I don't want to gloss over anything. Is there anybody have any questions? Anything that maybe didn't make any sense?
Well, something that I believe my understanding of it, when he was up on the mountain talking to God, when he was getting the 10 Commandments, and the people were down with Aaron, God is always planning ahead. They were saying, where is Moses? He isn't here. And they were unhappy. What are we going to do? Well, when Moses was on the mountain, God was giving Moses the blueprint as to what's going to happen, how to defeat Pharaoh. And when Moses came down off of the mountain and saw that they had made the calf out of their earrings, and he broke the tablet, they were unaware that God was preparing the way for them and the plans. And they were down on the bottom of the mountain being disgruntled. They just didn't have the patience and the faith to wait, because you have to wait on the Lord. He doesn't work on your timetable. He works on his.
Yeah. That's really good, because it's one of those things, like, so Moses is up on the mountain for 40 days and they're like, well, we don't know what happened to this guy. He's probably dead now. So, hey, Aaron, make us something. And Aaron's like, okay, well, give me some rings. And he got some rings. And I don't know if you've read the story before, really paid attention to Aaron's words. When Moses comes back down and says, what have you done? Aaron goes like this. He says, well, basically I put all the gold into the fire and then out popped a calf. I don't know how it happened. I didn't mold it. I didn't do anything. It just showed up. I don't know. I don't know Moses. I don't, and then the people, I don't know. They just started worship. I don't know what happened. Come on now. Right. Aaron, that's one of those, like, Aaron was the bigger brother, and you're thinking Moses was like, Aaron, come on now. But Angie, to your point, that was the whole thing. And that becomes the rub, or that becomes the story of the Israelite nation. That every time God is moving and orchestrating stuff, it's never fast enough. It's never in the right way for them. Oh, we don't have water. We don't have food. Oh, my sandals lasted for 38 years, but God could have gave me designer sandals. I mean, it's just crazy stuff. You look at and you begin to wonder, what are they doing? They begin to worship a cow that came, a bull, right? That came out of a fire as the one that brought him out of Egypt. It wasn't that didn't do anything for you. And yet you could definitely see then why Moses had to write Dueteronomy, why he had to remind them one more time. Because I can picture him probably near death going, well, the last time I left for an extended period of time, it only took him 40 days to turn, right? And actually in Deuteronomy, again, he does say to them, I know you guys aren't going to last very long. You're gonna run off, but just hope, but maybe I'll convince a couple of you to go forward. But you're so right.
Aaron wasn't supposed to be there. Moses was supposed to be the chosen one. And he came up with all these excuses. Well, I can't talk. I have a tongue. I can't speak. He says, well, God says, well, you have a brother. He'll talk for you. He will be my mouth. He will speak my words.
Right.
He wasn't supposed to be there. Aaron wasn't all that goody two shoes. He was always having Moses back, because sometimes he wanted to lead. He wanted to be the ringmaster.
Yep.
So Moses picked the wrong, not the wise choice. Sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, because he limited what God could do through him, right? Which brought someone else in that was never supposed to be there. Yeah. Yeah, because Aaron, and if we read the story, Aaron and Miriam actually go against Moses at one point.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Frank.
But I think, Pastor, I have heard it a lot of times, but this is the first time that I've heard it that can be able to break it down that way, because like she was saying, a lot of people was confused when Moses came down off the mountain. Why was he so upset? The reason was because now all at once, when I come down here, you guys, this is where we're going to live from now on. We're not going to live like we used to live. We're going to live like this. And I think what Aaron, you remember, don't forget, Aaron was with him with doing all these exciting things with the rod. So I guess Aaron figured, well, if I did this with the snakes and everything like that, I can get away with saying it just popped up out the thing. So I think that's where that was. But I'm telling you, I have never, ever seen that book brought the way you brought it.
Yes. I agree with Frank. I know it sounds like a lot of mumble jumble when you read it by yourself, one. And two, it sounds just like a bunch of words. And sometimes when I read it, I just put it away because it's like, gosh, I just can't get through it, and it's really irritating because it's like, I don't know if it's just a lot of genealogy or whatever that's called, or a constant just like word dropping or name dropping and things. But I know after listening to what you had to say, I got what you said about the verses about the relationship and what we're called to do. I realized how God was preparing in Dueteronomy for John the Baptist. because what I heard there was a spiritual baptism. So even though they weren't doing water baptisms yet until Jesus Christ was 33 years old, I just had an overwhelming sense of, oh my goodness, that is a baptism.
Mhm.
And that was the covenant that we take the bread and water for. I don't know, is that the prayer you use?
Yeah,
Because
you know, yeah, when you look at the Red Sea was the first baptism. Right?
Okay.
That they were actually baptized out of death, which is Egypt, right? That so from from here on out, when you read about Egypt, Egypt is a land of captivity. Egypt is a land of death, right? So when you hear them talking about Egypt, that's what you're talking about. So the idea of passing through the Red Sea, which actually comes later on, they talk about it, that it was the baptism. It was that original that they died to that, which is exactly what happens with us, right? When we're baptized and brought in. And so there's so much correlation. In fact, the book of Deuteronomy is the book that Jesus quotes the most of all the books.
Yeah.
Quotes the book of Deuteronomy because
That's
again, he's going
amazing.
to, there's one God. There's
Mhm.
such an important understanding there. And I think one of the things to recognize is when we read the Bible, there's a lot of people I know, I won't say a lot. There are people I know that want to try to read the Bible through in a year. And that is a daunting task. It's something I do every year. And I read it entirely in its entirety, right? And I'm not telling people not to do that, but I would say the majority of people should not undertake that. And this is what I mean by it. If I was to tell most of you on online right now how to read the Bible or what to read, I would tell you read Genesis, read the majority of Exodus, pay very little attention to Leviticus, then go into Numbers and read most of read all of Numbers, read the first part of Deuteronomy, read the last part of Deuteronomy. The reason being is because a lot of those laws, very spiritually deep, right? If you're reading to truly study and understand each and every moment what this means, how does this spot on my skin correlate to anything, right? If you're reading for that reason, then great, man. Get ready, get some good commentaries, get in there and study the Levitical laws. There's so much, it's wealth of knowledge in there. But if you're reading to understand the overarching story of God and the people of Israel, the nation, because how he worked with the people of Israel, the nation, is how he's working with us today, right? It's the precursor. What Jesus said, I've not come to abolish the law, but fulfill it, right? That's what you and I are dealing with. So when we look at God and how he relates in mercy and grace, but a standard of holiness with the people of Israel, he's relating the same thing to us. So as individuals, as non-scholars, right, reading the book of Leviticus, it would just confuse you. What Rachel say, mumbo jumbo. It might just seem like mumbo jumbo, and you're reading through, and you
Sorry about that.
aren't going to get a lot. But man, if you start reading the beginning of Exodus and then go right into Numbers from there, you begin to see the true narrative story. It begins to open up your mind like you've never seen it before, and go, okay, how is God relating that he is one God and he is their God? Oh, how is God trying to tell them that you are my people? How is God trying to explain to them how we relate together? And therefore, what is God saying to me? Because if he's saying it to the Israelites, I am your God, he's saying it to me, James, I am your God. You know, if
Yes.
he's saying to the Israelites, you are my treasured possession, he's saying the same thing to me. If he's saying to the Israelites, you are supposed to be a holy people, guess what? All those hyper grace people out there, and I don't think any of you guys are hyper grace, guess what? you still have a standard of holiness. You've got to understand that God expects us to be a holy people, set apart for him, right? So as you read Genesis through Deuteronomy, understand, guess what? It's okay to skip over begots. It's okay to skip over that, you know, the Ark of the Covenant is 2.5 cubits by 1.5 cubit by 1.5 cubit, made of acacia wood and overlaid by this and done this way, you know, made of one. It's okay to read over those. God will not strike you down for skipping those, right? Until you get to the point where you really want to study that section, then you spend time on studying it, and you grab someone who knows, or you grab some great commentaries. Frank?
Okay, let's go back to when Moses first got up there. The answer to the question was, God said, I am that I am. So that eliminated any question from that point on that you could question God. Whatever you want to say, he already told you, I am that I am. Yep. So if you want to say, well, I got a headache, I'm that. If you got a stomachache, I'm that. He already said that, and he cleared that up with Moses. Yeah. So I think when Moses came down, like you were saying, that to say, well, you got to do this from now on. Well, we wasn't doing it like just before. Well, yeah, but these are the commandments that you got to want to live by now. You want to follow me and you want to follow God.
That's a great point, because again, they're fighting polytheism, right? The many God concept, right? And so if for an Egyptian, you've got multiple gods, and if something's going wrong, you know, there's something wrong with the harvest, you go to one God. If there's something wrong with the I don't know, if you're sick, you go to another God. If you can't get pregnant, you go to another God. If you whatever is happening, you're going to go to a different God. And God said, I am.
That's right.
I am. There is no other God. You know, if you need harvest, I am. You know, to your point, right? So that's a great point, because God, right from the beginning, at the very start of the whole thing, it says, "There's one God, and I am that one God."
I am that I am.
You are going to follow that one God. You are my people. Great point.
When the 10 plagues they were not random, they were made at the gods. The frogs were seen as a god, because in Egypt there are flies, and if you don't have frogs to eat the flies, they come out of the oven. The flies were everywhere. Yeah. So the frogs were considered a blessing. They were a god. There was the god of the air. That's why the locusts came and ate up the fields. God was attacking the gods of Egypt. When the 10 plagues, they were all pointed at gods that the Egyptians honored. So he tore them down. He tore their gods down, and he was saying, I am that I am. This God is nothing. The frogs were looked upon. There were so many frogs. And then when they died, when all the frogs died, it stunk like I don't know what. So they had to get rid of all the dead frogs. He just kept beating them down and letting them see, I am that I am. It got to the point, and God wanted it to get to the point that they weren't going to let them go. They wanted to say, get the heck out of here, go. So they wanted to get rid of them.
Yeah.
And that's what God wanted, and that was his plan. And those plagues led up to that, but those plagues were also attacking their gods. Like when Moses threw down the cane and it turned into a snake, the priests were really stupid, because instead of trying to come up with something to kill Moses' snake, they made more snakes.
Yeah.
So God said, okay, I'll eat your snakes. And he ate them up, showing that he was, I am that I am.
And that's a great point, you know, I think of, I think it's Horus is the sun god. If I'm wrong, Ra. This is the sun god. You know, again, that's when you look at the different plagues, it took those things that they thought that they could pray to, and he fought them. He blotted out the sun, right? He blotted out the great god Ra.
And it happened again when Jesus was on the cross.
You know, when you think about what God was doing in Exodus, it's not only through the Exodus story of them leaving the Red Sea or passing through the Red Sea. We see the same concept through the remainder, all the way through the book of Dueteronomy, where God's trying to tell them all these other things that you followed before, they're not going to work. Because I am. That's who, you know, and it's such a countercultural thing for the Israelites, because all they know, and we've got to remember where they were. All they know is Egypt at this point. You know, they've lived there 400 years. All they know is Egypt. They know the gods of Egypt. They know that concept. Now, they had a concept of God, right? But of Yahweh, but not a very personal relationship with God. Not like what he was trying to set up and say, okay, now that I've pulled you out of Egypt, out of death, out of this slavery, and I've pulled you into this other thing, we're going to have a personal relationship, and you're going to know me. Hence why Moses asked, what's your name? Because they weren't really sure. Even though if you think about Abraham, Jehovah Jireh, that came from Abraham, right? And all these different names, Isaac and Jacob, gave God a bunch of names. But it took that moment where God said, okay, plot twist, I'm changing this. Now I'm going to grab a people, I'm going to grab a nation, and they're going to know me personally. And hence why it was such a big sin when they got to the mountain and they denied God and said, we don't want a personal relationship. We still want you to move through Moses.